Hello, this is Anita Fuentes, executive producer of the Security in Context podcast. And today I have the pleasure of talking to Omar Dahi and Firat Demir, co founders of Security in Context. This conversation is part of an upcoming episode of the Security in Context podcast about the implications of the Russia Ukraine conflict for the global south, featuring Counterpunch radio host Eric Draitser and scholars like Samara Belushi, Arlene Tickner, and Noha Buel Dahab. So, hi to both of you. I hope you're doing well. I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first question. Having listened to what our guests had to say on this matter, were there any specific points that resonated with you or that you think could be further developed? Or was there anything missing in the discussion that you would like to highlight, particularly since a lot of your research covers South South relations? Omar?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, hi Anita, hi Firat. It's good to be chatting with you guys today. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit how we came up with the idea of this episode. I mean, I think a lot of us were shocked and horrified by the invasion, which really was horrific in all sorts of ways, and it took us a while to recover and then start processing what was happening. I mean, the project Security in Context was founded on the idea that rejecting the idea that any country should be destroyed preemptively because of the security concerns of another country. And so after we started recovering and thinking about the shock from the invasion, um, we started also considering other issues and implications that were happening beyond the day-to-day destruction and the sort of tragedy of what was happening, um, both in terms of narratives that were emerging in the West, debates that were happening about the origins of the conflict. To what extent is this something that the West can be condemned for, things like the NATO expansion, versus sort of intrinsic factors that reflect sort of Russia's own foreign policy ambitions and the way it views itself and its relationship to the Ukraine. So there was a lot of debates happening in the West, but we also saw a lot of things that were missing, that were not being discussed, particularly things that are important for security in context, which is perspectives and implications and dynamics that affect the global South. And this is usually absent in Western media in the best of times, but particularly with the Ukraine conflict, there was quite a bit of focus on perspectives emanating from the US national security establishment, of course, European national security or sort of European security establishments as well. And so there was less attention to issues and implications from the global South, which particularly struck people as surprising when, for example, we saw votes in the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, where a significant number of global South countries abstained or didn't vote in the way that the US and Europe wanted them to vote. So there was lots of aspects that we wanted to sort of untangle and process a little bit more through the episode and with our guests. Some of it has to do with, and this has been commented on before, but the heavy dose of Western exceptionalism that permeated the coverage of the crisis, that seemed to basically place the Russian invasion beyond the norms of what Western countries, particularly the United States, has done and has been doing for the past decades. So there was this question of Western exceptionalism that was then countered by a non-Western exceptionalism, which tried to, in my opinion, whitewash the actions of Russia and so forth. So how do we sort of think about this dynamic or this binary and think through it from a perspective that is sympathetic to social justice, sympathetic to victims of the invasion, but also doesn't try to exceptionalize what's happening as part of wider global processes. Lots of our guests invoked issues related to the particular dynamics and concerns of different developing countries, and perhaps we can get into that in the discussion today.
What are your thoughts, Firat?
Yeah, I do agree that the current situation is quite complicated, and the global South is not a monolithic, uniform group. It's not homogenous, definitely. And we need to talk about perspectives. The same with the global North. But I think one thing that struck me the most, given that I was quite close region-wise to the conflict during the first half of this 2022 as a Fulbright fellow in Lithuania, and I could follow very closely the reactions of the people, both in the run-up to the war and also after the invasion. The general panic that people had and felt. For example, iodine tablets in the pharmacies were run out, and I had colleagues calling and telling me, "Friday, in case you need it, we have it." But also, there was this reaction in the news media in Europe, particularly, and the United States, that this how can such a thing happen in 2022? That portrayed this as a new event that has never happened, and definitely never happened as aggressors from the Western point of view. And it was especially and particularly interesting to follow the developments from within Lithuania, which went through Russian invasion together with the two other Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia in 1945. So there are still very fresh memories of Russian invasion in Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe. So there's that on the one hand, the fresh feelings and memories of people that happened under Russian invasion, and they could definitely connect with the experience Ukrainians were going through. But then on the other hand, there was this denial of other invasions and aggressions done either through their country's involvement directly. For example, the Iraq War, Ukraine sent soldiers directly to Iraq invasion. So did the three Baltic states. And when people were confronted with that experience and what that, it was not perhaps that much different regarding aggression and the justified claim that this is for preemptive strike to prevent another sovereign country from attacking and defending their own national interests, there was a disconnect. People really could not explain and justify. The closest that they could come up with was the historical experience and common past, either under Soviet Union or under the Warsaw Pact, because not all Central, East, and Northern Europe were under the Soviet Union, but they were satellites, like from Poland, for example. And another thing perhaps we can discuss later on more was the treatment of the human cost, the human element. Because at the time I arrived in Lithuania, there was a refugee crisis coming from mostly northern Iraq by people who were displaced from the invasion of Iraq, but also following Syrian civil war and so on. And some were economic refugees, some were humanitarian refugees. And if you remember the Syrian civil war and millions of refugees that were coming to Europe through Turkey, the reactions of countries such as Poland and others that were very negative, that did not want to share any of the burden the countries Italy and Greece were going through, or Turkey. But suddenly the refugees from Ukraine were welcomed with open arms. Unfortunately, the reported news on the media were quite disappointing, even on that account, that there were reports that your skin color was a bigger factor in welcoming you, even from Ukraine. And not everybody were welcome to those neighboring countries or otherwise from Ukraine.
Another question that I had for you is, well, all four of our guests pointed out that most global South countries have preferred not to take sides in the conflict, or have tried to refrain from taking actions that could harm their relationship with Russia. But would you say that there have been any like salient differences in the way that each region, so Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, etc., in the ways that they have responded to the conflict? And in which ways do you think that this war could reconfigure transnational solidarity dynamics?
Yeah, this is something that came up in the different responses of our guests. And I think, as Firat said, the global south is not homogeneous. So we're trying to, in this episode, sort of tease out what are the different regional specific dynamics. And even within those regions, there are differences across countries. And I think Professor Arlene Tickner mentioned how, Colombia, for example, which is a country that has historically had very close ties to the U.S. national security state and and sort of army and military and security ties, longstanding, has under the previous administration, the Duque administration, really gone out of its way to support the Western narrative. But even there, they're viewing it through the regional lens of, for example, their opposition to the Venezuelan government. So there are always ways in which the global South countries, and this is something that's often misunderstood, is that they're also responding to their priorities, their concerns, whether these concerns are things that are global in nature but different from Western security concerns. For example, food security, which is something that all of our guests talked about, which is going to be a really serious issue moving forward. That's the priority of global South countries right now. For many Western countries, that's not the priority that they're. I mean, they might be lending lip service to it. So there's that element of it. But I think despite these differences, there are common denominators. And the common denominator that has come out is that, quite simply, most global South countries see this as a Western conflict against Russia. They don't view it through the necessarily through the lens that of something that they have to condemn or that they have to sign up fully to the Western agenda in isolating Russia and in bankrupting Russia, which is increasingly what is coming out, especially with the sanctions and so on. And I think Noha Abul Dahab mentioned that, for example, many Middle Eastern states are reluctant to sign on to any um, political campaign that completely isolates any country, let alone a major country like Russia, not just because of the current material interests that they have with Russia, but also they don't want this to happen to them in the future. So I think the dynamics that come out is very much an awareness and weariness of signing up uh, to fully subscribing to the U.S. led response to the Russian invasion. And this comes out particularly in Africa, for example, these dynamics where, and we actually in the panel that we did in March 12th of this year with Professor Michael Clare, Bob Vitalis, Emily Meyerding, we talked about the geopolitics of oil. And one of the things that Michael Clare brought out is the increasing way in which this conflict is going to be used through the lens of great power competition. And the US is going to instrumentalize the conflict to force global South countries to choose, you're either with us or you're with China and Russia. And perhaps the China role is going to become more apparent, actually. The real target of the US national security state eventually is China, not Russia. And so some are brought up the Countering Russian Malign Activities in Africa Act, which is already being drafted and which can potentially force developing countries in Africa to choose sides if they want aid or if they want basically further cooperation with the West. So you can see how there's a real rejection of this conflict being instrumentalized to force the global South countries to pick sides and to essentially be pawns in this great power competition conflict.
Firat.
To follow up on that, I'm definitely, even from within the same regions, there's significant differences across countries. And when right after the invasion, one of the major Western European news agency, for example, was portraying the conflict as this is the first time since Second World War a major European city is being bombed, which was not correct. Belgrade was bombed, Sarajevo was bombed. If you just focus even on Europe, and they are more Western European than Kiev, that doesn't change the fact of the brutality of the invasion. But even within Europe, if you look at Western and Eastern Balkans, they have significant differences, or even countries like Hungary have significant differences than Poland. And within the global South, if we define it in a very broad terms, which would include some of the European countries as well, if you take the Middle Eastern countries or Central and Western Asian countries, there are significant differences across the board. And some of them are trying to have this delicate balance. Take Turkey, for example. Turkey has significant trade relationships and security partnerships with both Ukraine and Russia. On the one hand, they are selling unmanned airplanes to the so-called Bayraktar planes to Ukraine, even donating some of them, and at the same time having significant trade relations with Russia and Ukraine. Wheat and grain imports from both countries are significant, but also natural gas. Turkey is significantly dependent on Russian natural gas flows, as well as security concerns from Turkish perspective in Middle East that differ from the U.S. perspectives regarding their own security priorities. Africa is not any different. Asia is not either. And I think one major concern within the global South is bringing China into the equation. And my reading of it is that Chinese leadership is trying to limit their involvement. And I don't think they are approving what Russia did. I think they were not expecting it as much as others. But the use of the Russian invasion and trying to create a new axis of evil, including Russia and China in the equation, is really worrisome and concerning for all countries, not just those in the South. A new Cold War is, I would like to say, starting, unfortunately, but I think has already started with the expansion of NATO further to Sweden and Finland, countries which stayed, Sweden stayed neutral for more than 100 years. Finland had major wars and lost land to Russia, but other than that, had peaceful relations with Russia. And that further expansion, I think, is not going to help with the situation, definitely. And we have other countries on the list, from Ukraine to Georgia, that might be a recipe for further conflict. On top of that, you have the administration in Russia, which to me has really little control or understanding of the situation on the ground, like any other dictatorship. And Russia is what it is to me. The leadership of the country has little understanding of the problem, and the top administration are stuffed with people who are not merit based, but based on connections and yes men. And Putin's display of justification of the war was a very clear example of it. And this is a country with thousands of warheads, nuclear warheads. So that's really scary. And the global South can play a balancing role here, including China. And I think the best that could happen would be for Western Europe and the US to find a way to bring China into a more neutral position rather than demonizing and creating a new Cold War with Russia and China on the one hand, and then either you are with us or against us. And invasion of Baghdad and bombing of Baghdad is in none of the discussions here. Right? If you look at the human cost of invasion of Ukraine, it is humongous in terms of physical infrastructure, but also human cost. And I don't like comparing human lives. One life is one too many. But we are talking about millions of lives that are lost in invasion of Iraq. And then you are looking at a country like Syria, where almost half, if not more, of the country has been displaced, either internally or externally. We are talking about next 50, 60 years of this country is lost. Iraq still doesn't have 24-hour electricity in a given day, and nobody's talking about rebuilding it. And Afghanistan is also there, where the Western troops have withdrawn, and women don't even have the right to go to school anymore, despite 20 years of promises. On top of that, now we have the Ukrainian invasion, and the biggest concern people are raising is how can this happen today? Well, it has been happening for the last century, almost every decade. We have a major conflict.
Yeah, it's all very true. I mean, we did a really good episode. Our first episode of the Security and Context podcast was about Afghanistan, and I think it's always interesting to go back to that discussion as well, from the perspective of what's happening now, especially with the Russia Ukraine conflict. I wanted to ask you both if there are any concluding remarks that you like to share. We're running out of time, so if there's any further issues that you'd like to bring up, now's the time.
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, I mean, we wanted to keep this short, but just to conclude, I mean, I wanted to thank Firat and you for doing this today. And one thing I wanted to point out is one of the common denominators is this question of non-alignment. And Firat and I have done a lot of work. I mean, our book was about comparing the past and present of South-South relations, and ways in which it was considered a positive alternative for North-South relations, how relations among developing countries can really bring about alternative and more positive economic, political, social outcomes. And I think this question is now returning to the fore because, on the one hand, we see what the Western dynamic is pushing for, which is also something that we reject, and as we talked about today, this sort of forcing countries into a corner. On the other hand, as we've shown, the rise of China and their economic influence has really ambiguous effects, to say the least. In some ways, it can be positive. In some ways, it can be highly negative and create highly uneven outcomes in the same way that replicates North-South dynamics. So I think it's something to look out for, and something we'll be revisiting more and more is lots of the rest of the global South. If we take China as one of the big powers now, the rest of the global South really wants to be non-aligned and try to uh, uh, play off or benefit from both sides rather than be forced into a corner. And the question is, to what extent will they be able to do that?
I fully agree, but there's also the aspect of this playing. I think Global North has been doing also. I think we should stop thinking that the security concerns, however legitimate it is for one country or for one nation or for one group of people, at the expense of another, is not the way to go. The expansion of addition of two additional NATO members, if that means losing the security promises given, for example, to a large ethnic group like Kurds, to satisfy the security concerns of those in Finland and Sweden, that is really on principle. It's not following the principles that they claim to be following. Like if you look at the founding principles of European Union, at least on paper, and then in order to be able to join NATO, so that these countries have security assurances against Russian expansionism. But then, if that means we have to give up very legitimate concerns of another ethnic group, that it really doesn't fix the problem. This is a zero-sum game, and we need to be able to find a way of bringing this out of zero-sum game so that it becomes win-win for all sides. And non-aligned movement, not just for the South but for the North, I think is the way to go. And also start seeing that these are really complicated issues. And what global power competition does, or what real politics, the so-called at the nation state level, it should be different than at the people's level. People on the ground, on the streets, should be able to understand and relate very legitimate concerns and experiences people are going through. And no less in Europe. Every country in Europe went through a refugee crisis, either from within themselves. Take Germany, a significant number of them have become refugees. Take Baltic states, a significant number, up to a third of these countries were refugees, displaced after invasion by Russia or other forces. And when another country goes through a similar experience, rather than saying this is not my problem or demonize one group of people without addressing the real issues, is not going to make it right or better, but instead helps reproduce the same type of conflicts going forward.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for sharing your thoughts on a very important issue. The full podcast will be released very soon on all podcasting platforms as well as on YouTube and Status Hour. So stay tuned and don't miss it.